So, as we see the escalations between Venezuela and America reach peak levels, there's something bigger behind all this that I think can illustrate where we might be going, and very few people seem to recognize it. Now, while the world is fixated understandably on Ukraine, Gaza, Taiwan, the US is continuing its maritime strikes on various ships. Not arrests, not interceptions, but military strikes on small wooden boats that have been justified as anti-narcotic operations. But it's more than that, and can demonstrate where things could continue to grow. It's not normal law enforcement, and crucially, it's nothing like the US usually does in terms of traditional operations in conventional theaters of conflict. What's unfolding off Venezuela's coast looks less like traditional US military intervention and more like a new, experimental model of force projection taking shape in real time. It's the testing ground for what some may see as a new model of offshore American power. You see, for over a century, Washington has treated the Caribbean as its strategic backyard. From the Monroe Doctrine or Cold War proxy wars to the Nazis' induction campaigns against Colombian cartels, purely geography has defined America's hegemonic power over this part of the world. But what happens now goes even further than that. Some things like double-tap strikes, unverified intelligence, dozens being killed, and tales of a Venezuelan president who is now sleeping in a different location every single night to avoid a precise hit from the Trump administration. It's not about drugs, it never really was. It's about how far America can go. So in this video, we're going to break down what these latest strikes mean, the continuous verbal escalations between admirals Pete Hegseth and Trump, and why the Caribbean is on the precipice of becoming one of the most dangerous geopolitical fronts in the world, as the US tries to push the boundaries of lethal force without calling it a war.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we focus on the intersection of geopolitics, economic statecraft, and international relations, focusing on the escalations between Venezuela and this time. Because you see, a US Navy admiral has ordered a second round of military strikes on an alleged Venezuelan drug boat. The first strike had already destroyed the vessel, but according to multiple reports, 2 people survived clinging to this wreckage, and so the US government decided it should be struck again. So the White House later confirmed the second strike, with lawmakers from across the political spectrum of America demanding explanations. Journalists asking uncomfortable questions about, are these combat operations or extrajudicial killings? Admiral Frank Bradley, the man who authorized the second strike, describing it as acting within authority and the law. But since early September, as some of you may have seen, over 80 people have now been killed in similar kind of operations. Each time the US releases a grainy clip of a distant boat exploding, sometimes even without proving drugs were on board, it raises questions about all the operations that Trump administration claims it is doing or that it intends to do. But why now? Why is all this happening around Venezuela? To understand this shift, we have to zoom out. You see, for years, Washington's attitude towards the Caribbean has been shaped by the Monroe Doctrine, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and decades of the Cold War competition. In US strategic thinking, this region is not a distant threat. It's a home turf, it's backyard, and geography is volumes in, geopolitics. Venezuela, particularly under Nicolas Maduro, is now the region's biggest outlier and pain for Donald Trump, despite his love for autocrats elsewhere. Venezuela is a collapsing petrostate, a regime accused of corruption, repression, and human rights abuses. And rightly or wrongly, Washington claims the Venezuelan military and top officials run some kind of narco-terrorist cartel. This legal framing matters, of course, because if you can label a group narco-terrorists, that legitimizes the US military to suddenly gain broad authority to conduct whatever lethal operations under the rules of non-international armed conflict. This is how the US can fire missiles at small boats in the Caribbean while claiming it isn't at war. But here's the irony with that, because drug interdiction has been the excuse. Venezuela has become the testing ground, and the real target is, of course, Maduro, if it's possible. Any such military operation will be incredibly difficult to carry out. But the president of Venezuela is on the run, the strikes triggering something rather extraordinary, with multiple claims that Maduro now switches beds, locations, every single night. He changes phones continuously. He's convinced that the US might attempt some kind of precision strike or a special forces raid directly targeting him, because a full-scale conventional military operation would be near impossible based on the maritime basis it would have to occur on. To avoid betrayal, Maduro has expanded his personal bodyguard with Cuban security officers, people who he can trust more than his own armed forces. Cuban counterintelligence officers, who have been historically very effective, have been embedded more deeply into the Venezuelan military. Publicly, he dances at rallies, posts TikToks, he cracks jokes. But behind these scenes, there is the uncomfortable tension and reality, the paranoia, the fear of any kind of betrayal, and the behavior quintessential of a leader who believes a foreign military might be preparing a decapitation strike. For decades, closer to a century, the US has blurred the lines, you see, between policing and conventional military warfare in Latin America. Long before drones or narco-terrorism frameworks, Washington treated the Caribbean and northern South America as a sphere where it could basically do whatever it wanted with no equivalent resistance. In the early 20th century, under Roosevelt, the US fought what became known as the Banana Wars. Repeated invasions, occupations, and naval blockades across Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Honduras. These operations were justified as stabilizing missions, but in practice they normalized something else: rapid deployments, unilateral action, and an almost casual use of military force to shape political outcomes, which is why we have such political instability across the region, but also what has inspired many other countries to adopt some of the early tactics that America actually created. This pattern continued into the Cold War. The US backed coups in Guatemala and Chile, funded anti-communist militias across Central America, and turned the Caribbean basin into a kind of geopolitical shock absorber, a space where Washington could project power cheaply and decisively. The objective, therefore, with justification shifting, but the operational habits have stayed the same. By the 80s and 90s, the war on drugs became the dominant framing. Plan and Colombia blurred insurgency with counter-narcotics operations, with US advisors, surveillance, aircraft, and special forces trainers operating in these gray zone between military and police work. And then, in 1989, the US set a crucial precedent when it invaded Panama to remove Manuel Noriega, the first time alleged drug crimes became the statute legal basis for a regime change. The 2000s added this technological evolution, targeted killings and what's known as double tap strikes, which first began in Pakistan and then Yemen. These operations were often justified with what's under known broad interpretations of self-defense. You can look to the NATO video I made just yesterday about preemptive strikes. The idea of international law being pulled and tweaked just as much as it can for countries' self-interests. The difference this time is, as I keep saying, geography. This is the same model: rapid strikes, minimal transparency, flexible legal justification, is being tested much closer to home in a region where US power has always been assertive but rarely this overtly lethal. And unlike, say, Yemen or Pakistan, Venezuela sits beside major shipping lanes, critical energy routes, and neighbors who are extremely sensitive to any sign of American escalation. Moreover, what this does for the narrative around the hypocrisy of the United States or the Western-led order more broadly, and why I think it's even more of a problem than we may think in a kinetic warfare sense. The administration denies any wrongdoing, of course, with Hegseth calling these allegations fabricated, Trump saying he never ordered the men to be killed. But even if lawful, in the loosest sense, this precedence is dangerous, and this is the core message of this video. Because once you normalize lethal strikes outside declared war zones, the threshold for intervention collapses. Today it's small boats, tomorrow maybe naval assets, eventually the presidential palace. Shadow conflicts quietly become real ones. And what does this do for other countries that have issues with neighboring states or seek territorial reacquisitions? I'm thinking maritime theaters in the Southeast Asia, if you know what I mean. So Washington, what does it really want? This is the question. Trump calls Maduro this narco-terrorist, and interestingly, his teams are negotiating. Leaks revealed in the past few days suggest that a possible exit deal from Maduro may be possible. Pressure to resign, a 2027 referendum, and lifting sanctions in exchange for reforms. Amnesty from Maduro's inner circle, a transition involving his vice president. In short, the US is applying as much military pressure not just to hit drug boats, but to force those political concessions. It's about as much of a regime change as you can without forcibly running into the office and grabbing him out of his chair. This is a mixture of economic statecraft, one of the three pinges we talk about on this channel, mixed with more classical military coercion. A pressure campaign designed to reshape regime without formal war. The Caribbean strikes are simply the newest tool and the most public and obvious. Now, it goes without saying that Maduro is weakened internally. The economy has collapsed by 70%. Elections were lost last summer, but then ignored. And anyone who likes to claim that they weren't doesn't understand what real rigging of elections is. He does not have popularity to the point where Venezuelans I have in the country, friends of mine, and the diaspora all say they would welcome some kind of US military operation. But the way that it's being done is not the way to do it. Maduro security forces repress these protests, criminalize dissent, and control the cause. And a leader cornered, paranoid, losing any of he has legitimacy left, is extremely vulnerable. But that means he can be reckless. But interestingly, his long-standing allies, be them Russia, Iran, China, aren't likely to get involved. But the key point here is that this could become a template. It's the kind of template that actually is developing. What the US is experimenting with in the Caribbean is not merely a tactical choice, it's the early architecture of a new type of category of conflict that operates in the space between law enforcement, counterterrorism, special operations, and grey zone coercion. What Russia is doing in various parts of Europe is a variation of this, but with more emphasis on cyber, you could argue. Think of it as a four-pillar model. One, legal elasticity. Reclassifying criminal groups as narco-terrorists instantly expands the scope of permissible military action. It creates a sliding scale of force where Washington can escalate without triggering the domestic or international obligations associated with a formal war. It's the weaponization of the legal ambiguity. Trump's not making unlawful or illegal moves, he's just bending it as much as possible. Second, it's the offshore lethality. Instead of boots on the ground, the US uses maritime platforms, drones, helicopters, standoff munitions. This reduces political risk, avoids body bags, and keeps operations compartmentalized. It mirrors an African model that we've seen, the Niger model, Somalia, the Sahel pattern, where kinetic operations occur with minimal visibility, America's own form of plausible deniability. Thirdly is intelligent light targeting. Unlike, say, counterterrorism missions that rely on long surveillance tails, these strikes appear to operate with low thresholds, basically unverified intelligence, rapid decisions, and a minimal documentation. It's just basically you see it. Does it look pretty dodgy? Let's take it out. And fourthly, strategic messaging. The operations serve as a dual purpose: deny illicit networks capacity and send a coercive signal to hostile governments, in this case, to Maduro. You are reachable, you are vulnerable, and the escalation of military forces on the table, even if we're having our back-to-backdoor diplomacy and put these four together, you get this hybrid form of coercive power that sits below invasion but above sanctions, a sort of the spectrum where peacemaking, diplomacy is one side, sanctions in the middle, and full-scale conventional military operations on the other. Sort of sits between those two. Washington doesn't want to fully invade, but it can't rely on Venezuela just to do it itself. So interestingly, if the model works here, it becomes exportable, a template for dealing with unsustainable or unstable and adversary states without the cost of, say, in Iraq or Afghanistan, a way to punish, weaken, destabilize governments while avoiding the political baggage of a declared conflict. The number of states actively declaring war in an official sense has plummeted since the end of the Second World War, and it's not something countries seem to need to do anymore. And the Caribbean is simply the testing ground for this. Washington wants to see what it can get away with, or Trump thinks what he can get away with, and ensure that his power is seen more effectively. Whether this becomes a disaster or some kind of new doctrine, therefore, depends on what happens next. Does US escalate? Does Maduro retaliate? And if so, how? What would it do? What would regional states say? Would they do anything? Maduro is not popular. And where does Congress draw a line? Does it have the power to rein Trump in? Or does this shadow war quietly expand? In the Caribbean, no longer a quiet neighborhood, but becoming one, as I say, of the most dangerous geopolitical frontlines of the 2020s. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think. Coming to you here from Canary Wharf, London. My name is Pyotr Kurzin, and I'm a mix of British, Russian with a background in strategic studies in economics. And I try to bring this nuanced, diversified set of views to this channel. And you can find ways to support me by just clicking the video, it's free, or supporting me through buying me a coffee or becoming a member through the links in the description. We'll see you all next time. Take care.